in my brief eavesdropping, it seemed like the conversations were very rich and very animated. So thank you so much for the energy and time you put into it. I think that's very much a reflection of the passion that all of us feel for where we live and the great fortune, the great good fortune we have to live here and be an active part of it. And of course, much of the reason that we are blessed to live in this extraordinary place is the federal lands which surround us. And in a similar blessing, we have 4 extraordinary individuals who are in charge of the federal lands which we get to share with our fellow community members and the world at large. And it was pointed out to me in past years by one of the panelists currently up here that there might have been a little bit of gender inequity by not having women go first. And so because we're flexible, as a middle-aged white guy, I'm exceptionally flexible. I thought I would try to rectify that. And so what we'll have now is our 4 federal land managers, Tricia O'Connor, David Vella, Pat Kenny, and Brian Glaspell, each talk for about 10, 15 minutes about the state of their jurisdictions. And then we will have a question and answer session open up to the room. We'll break for lunch after that. So that's what you can expect for the next hour or so.
Good morning. Glad to be here to participate in the conversation and share a few thoughts about values of the Fish and Wildlife Service and some of the things that are going on at the elk refuge. A few months ago, Lori Iverson, who represented us here last year and did an excellent job, she warned me that this event was coming up, and so I started thinking then a little bit about what I might have to say, and then Jonathan called to extend the invitation and tell me what he wanted me to talk about, and my first inclination was to do something I learned watching all the political debates over the last couple of years, which is totally ignore the moderator and focus on my own agenda. But it turns out, upon further thinking, that what I had thought I wanted to say is really very much in line with the kind of core values theme for our talks today. And so what I'm going to do is start off talking about some core values, and then maybe reflect a little on how I think some of those core values they're in danger of harming us, of impeding our agenda and our conservation goals at the Fish and Wildlife Service, given the context that we're working in now. And then I'll finish up with some of the things you can expect to see on the refuge in the coming year. So it's often said that Fish and Wildlife Service has a really complicated mission, and it's true that we have really diverse programs. Aside from the National Wildlife Refuge System, we are responsible for administering the Endangered Species Act and protecting migratory birds and a host of marine mammals. We have special agents working around the world on wildlife trafficking issues. Many people don't know this, but every major airport in the nation has a Fish and Wildlife Service inspector checking cargo and luggage for illegal wildlife products. In Alaska, the Fish and Wildlife Service has primary responsibility for protecting subsistence hunting and fishing rights for rural residents and Native Alaskans. I could go on and on, but fundamentally, at the core, we are a conservation organization. That is the core value: conservation of fish and wildlife and their habitats. And I personally find that really comforting, I guess, to get up in the morning and say, this is what I do. I work in conservation. And I think you could ask just about any employee of the Fish and Wildlife Service, and they would say the same thing. That's what we do. Fundamentally, that's our core value. So the mission statement of the Fish and Wildlife Service reads as follows: working with others to conserve, protect, and enhance fish, wildlife, plants, and their habitats for the continuing benefit of the American people. And I think that statement really does capture what we're all about. You notice the first part is working with others, and that is a value that's really born of necessity. So most national wildlife refuges are small; they're just postage stamps on the landscape, and wildlife don't stay put on those postage stamps, and we don't have a whole lot of people to do our work. Nationwide, there are about 8,000 employees in the Fish and Wildlife Service. Here at the National Elk Refuge, we have just 10 boxes on our org chart. So working with others is essential. It's ingrained. It's really part of the agency culture, as is working with volunteers. Within the refuge system, we rely heavily and really value volunteers and the spirit of volunteerism. There are just over 560 national wildlife refuges, and almost everybody in the nation lives within 40 miles of one. So there's real opportunity for this kind of local backyard volunteer effort. Just about everybody can claim to support their local wildlife refuge. In 2017 at the Elk Refuge, we hosted 162 individual volunteers, and collectively they contributed 22,232 hours of their time. And if you add that up, that's almost exactly equivalent to the paid staff time for all our federal employees at the refuge. So we're doubling our reach with that volunteer effort. Many of our volunteers are not local, but community involvement and support is another core value. The establishment of the National Elk Refuge can very clearly be tied to local advocacy, and that kind of local interest and support has been critical to our operation since for more than 100 years now. Among the things that I personally value, and that I think we really value at the refuge, is that level of community interest and engagement. It's perhaps the critical core value for this that represents ballast for tempestuous times, as to use Jonathan's phrase. So, kind of putting all that together and adding a character element to it. If the Fish and Wildlife Service were a person, we'd be something like a Midwest dairy farmer or some other character from a Prairie Home Companion. Quiet, stoic, introverted. Yeah. A little shabby, but pretty good looking if we clean up a little. You know, we'd drive a car with 200,000 miles on it that we fix ourselves. We'd never buy new gear because the old stuff just works fine. You get the idea. This is who we are, and it's certainly been something to be very proud of. And there are lots of examples right here in town. A very tangible example that many of you may be familiar with. In the 1990s, when we outgrew our headquarters office building right at the end of Broadway there, which has since been repurposed as a residence, there was no money available to contract and build a new office building, so staff did it themselves. I'm not familiar with another example where we had a completely in-house construction project at that scale. And the building we all work out of now was built by staff in a year. And there are lots of other examples of that kind of just figure it out and get it done sort of approach to things. So thanks to this extremely dedicated staff and community support and partners like the Grand Teton Association and the Boy Scouts, we've consistently figured out how to get the job done, whatever the job is, and we almost never complain. Right, so these core values and character traits, the working with others, sometimes really leaning on volunteers in the community and quietly plugging away to get the conservation job done. Like I said, those are commendable. We have a shared sense of pride in all that. The downside is that we risk not telling the whole story about what it really costs to protect places like the Elk Refuge and our other public lands, and we also risk failing to accurately represent the value of those places to the broader public. I think nationally, the Fish and Wildlife Service has generally failed to tell our story and and connect with people as effectively as our friends at the National Park Service and the Forest Service. And I think that's not because our mission or our work is any less compelling. It's because as an organization, we've just long viewed ourselves as that that Midwest dairy farmer who would never complain or never jump up and down and say, over here, we need some help, look at us. And I do think there's a recognition of this at the national level. We have a number of national and regional initiatives aimed at branding, at relevancy, at connecting with diverse audiences, and so on. And some of those things you'll see reflected in the program of work at the Elk Refuge this year and for years into the future. And I'll jump into a few of those now. So site planning at the Murie Family Park in the Jackson Hole and Greater Yellowstone Visitor Center. There's a lot going on in that neck of the woods. That we've got the Hidden Hollow housing development charging ahead. The city has a plan to redesign and improve the North Cache streetscape. Public Art has funding and a proposal for a wildlife viewing walkway, and we're hoping to begin planning and fundraising for a new visitor center building. So rather than look at all those individual pieces in isolation, we're going to conduct a comprehensive site plan. And we have a contract secured to help us out in the support of our regional office, and I anticipate jumping full bore into that effort in the next month. Now, this is a fun one. Bison and elk management step-down planning. We will continue to work to fully implement our 2007 Bison and Elk Management Plan that was developed in concert with Grand Teton National Park. There's been a lot in the news lately about the threat of chronic wasting disease, or CWD. That's a threat we take very seriously. It's my hope that we'll finalize and begin to implement our so-called step-down management plan this year, which describes a methodology for addressing habitat impacts and disease threats by progressively transitioning from intensive winter feeding of elk and bison to a greater reliance on natural forage. Gros flood repair. This is something I know David is very familiar with. He and his staff have been working on repairs to the Gros Road where it washed away during last year's high water event. It's my understanding that work will continue this summer, and some of that work is on the refuge. Our boundary there is the north bank of the river. Similarly, we've been working with the park and the county to address flood damage on the northwest corner of the refuge near the North 89 Pathway Bridge. That area was also significantly damaged and altered by the high water event, and I expect that work will occur in 2018. Urban and High Visitation Refuges Initiative. This is one of those national and regional initiatives that we are a part of. There's a new emphasis on urban, proximate, and high visitation refuges as a way to reach more diverse audiences. We're among those high visitation refuges. In fact, our visitor center is in any given year either the first or second most visited facility in all of the refuge system. I'm not sure yet how this particular initiative will play out or look on the Elk Refuge, but one immediate effect is that we're going to hire a new visitor services position this year, and it's a really big deal to add staff when other staffs at other refuges are shrinking and positions are staying vacant, and this reflects that national emphasis on building visitor services capacity where we have the opportunity to reach a whole bunch of people. And last, staffing. While we're adding that one position, we lost Amanda Solid, a long-time facilities maintenance lead at the refuge, and it's not clear if or when we'll be able to fill that position. The slightly silver lining there is that we've sort of reinvigorated our relationship with the Jackson National Fish Hatchery, who also have a maintenance vacancy, and we're looking at opportunities to share housing and staff to meet our collective needs. So to wrap up, just a quick personal note. Like Pat, I'm just closing in on a year in my job, and 1 year ago today, I was home in Fairbanks, Alaska, with my wife Heidi. We were stoking the wood stove and listening to the neighbors' sled dogs howl and trying to imagine life in Jackson. And I'd heard a lot of things. I heard that this was a community that was full of really passionate wildlife advocates and conservation advocates. I heard that there were at least 1,000 elk biologists here, only one of whom I'd have the opportunity to supervise at the refuge. I heard that the traffic was really bad and that I'd never be able to afford the housing. And I heard that I was just going to love it, and that the community and the opportunities and everything here would make me never want to leave. And all of those things have proven to be true. So we have a lot of important work to do at the refuge and more broadly in Teton County and the region, and I'm very much looking forward to being part of that for a long time to come.
First, thank you so much for your excellent, much appreciated service. I'm wondering if you would be willing to give us an honest assessment about how the current administration's policy on climate change is translating into what happens with the allocation of resources, the focus of research, and the link between science and decision making at your jurisdictions. And if you are willing, please do. And maybe we can tell the journalists of the room to turn off their machines.
So the Fish and Wildlife Service has a national strategic planning document. It's called Addressing the Crisis of Climate Change or something like that. And as far as I know, that's still the law of the land. That document directs us, for example, to do things like address and consider climate change in our comprehensive conservation documents that every national wildlife refuge has to have. So we may yet see some changes in how we implement that, but it sure hasn't happened yet. And I would agree 100% with what David said. I mean, we can use different language or dance around the issue, but what's happening on the ground is undeniable. At Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, where I came from, it didn't matter what part of the political spectrum you were on. You just could not go to a rural community in northern Alaska and deny that there were significant changes occurring on the ground. Today, it's raining in Fairbanks, Alaska, and the average temperature there in January is minus 20-something. So those kind of things at a certain level, I think, for me personally, when I'm working with people on the ground and talking in specific detail about how we're going to manage resources, you just can't pretend otherwise. And so I guess I'd use that phrase one more time. It's pretty much business as usual.
This is for Brian at the National Elk Refuge. It's exciting that you're going to start a planning process to expand the visitor center. The Murray Family Park is such a pivotal location to interpret the conservation story of Jackson and the North Gateway to Jackson. When do you think that process will start, and how will the public be able to participate?
I'm envisioning sort of a multi-phase approach here. The first thing is what I mentioned in my talk, this site plan, and that would step down from our comprehensive conservation plan. Really sounding like a bureaucrat here. So that comprehensive plan has some very generic stuff, like it says in essence, if we're going to increase visitor infrastructure with things like wildlife viewing boardwalks, that place, the Murray Park, the Greater Visitor Center area, is pretty much where those kinds of things would occur. But it doesn't give us further direction about exactly where they might occur, construction details, or alternatives to discuss. So this site plan, I would imagine, will consider the North Cache streetscape and potential walkways or access from Hidden Hollow. It'll have some different potential scenarios for wildlife viewing and interpretive displays, and we talk about the the siting, the location, the orientation, the ingress and egress, and the parking for the visitor center building, but not the design details of that facility. And I think all of those things that I just mentioned for the site plan, we're going to begin that in February. We have a contractor, it's a landscape architecture firm, and among their deliverables are drawings and details about all those different pieces. And I would imagine in typical planning fashion, we would kind of mix and match some combinations of those different elements and then present them to the public for some feedback. And at the end of that process, we'll have an environmental analysis and this comprehensive site plan, and then we move on to talking in more detail about the visitor center building.
Hi. First off, thank you for sharing all your information and being accessible to us. My question is around future pending government shutdowns, what they might look like for you, and if they're potentially any different than previous shutdowns under the previous administration.
So one key factor that makes every shutdown threat different is the timing of the year. If we'd had one back in September or October, we'd be looking at impacts to the hunting season on the refuge, and now that we're into mid to late January, we could potentially be looking at impacts to supplemental feeding on the refuge. And so as we're sort of evaluating how we approach each of these, that's really one of the key factors, is the time of the year and the activities that potentially could be impacted. But for us, I personally have taken the approach of not asking too many questions, because usually the answers aren't good ones. And so we have got all of our everybody that's involved in the supplemental feed program on the list of accepted employees that would continue to work in the case of a shutdown, and that's when I stopped asking anything else.
I'm going to throw in one word on that. Right before the last shutdown, whenever that, or potential shutdown, I was talking to Dan Wank, and he was late getting on the call because he was in a planning meeting, because they were planning, I don't know how many, the point is I don't know how many man hours you people are putting into silliness of the highest order. Your budgets are, I mean, that was an extraordinary number, about 50% more people and no more money. And Tricia, I can't imagine your budget's in any better shape. What a profound waste of human energy, and what tremendous disregard for you people as public officials. And I'm so sorry to hear that. I would like to ask each of you to just one last word. What is one thing that you would like to leave folks with? What is the one big thing? And for you other future speakers, that's a little foreshadowing, as they say in English scholarship, of what I'll be asking of you as well. But if you just leave us with one thing.
I guess we need your continued support. As I said earlier, it's such a critical part of what we do, and it's only more so as time goes on. Thanks.